Before we go and discuss the media today, I kind of want you to, if perhaps lay out the media landscape during the time of the emergency. Advani very popularly said, when asked to bend, they crawled. I know there have been two accounts. One is a very valorized account in which they say that there was a group of these journalists who really fought, while others completely succumbed. But I'm sure the landscape was far more complicated than existing black and white accounts of what we usually read.
Yeah, I think, what is most important once again is, the 70s was still a period or a time when business, in terms of in terms of manufacture, was predominantly a public sector prism. Mm. That, in fact, caused or led the media to be completely dependent on the government. Mm. While the newsprint was actually decontrolled, newsprint predominantly was also imported, and there were all those trends. And secondly, when we are talking about technology, this was also the time when the facsimile technology, where you can actually have multiple editions printed from one center, and these are things that were just sort of coming in. And in fact, a much more sort of charitable kind of an explanation would be that there were two sections in the media: one that had the money and was sort of waiting for any kind of a technology to arrive that could actually help them use the technology to expand their business as a proposition, and there was another that was committed to a certain idea of, when I'm talking about the other, let me specifically say it was Ramnath Goenka and the statesman, that is Irani. And both of them had reasons. In fact, Ramnath Goenka belonged to the kind of the grand opposition combined. He was himself a candidate from Chengalpat in Tamil Nadu in the 1967 election. And he had associated himself very closely as with the opposition to the Congress. C.R. Irani, again, sort of, the kind of influence that Nani Palkiwala had over, let's say, the statesman and the kind of institutions also led to a certain kind of a political positioning. And, notwithstanding the fact that, there were what you call journalists who actually sort of, risked a lot of things. But essentially, there were, it was, let's also sort of, keep in mind when we talk about the media in the 70s, we are talking only about the print. We didn't have the television, which was again a preserve, the Doordarshan, which I consider is becoming more of a threat to democracy. And in that sense, it was easy and possible for the government during the emergency to contain them, to tell them that look, according to the law, you're supposed to submit the pages and the layout to a censor officer who will sit through the night. And this also led to the Indian Express as a newspaper chain being destroyed as an economic business model proposition. The Statesman also suffered. Its downslide actually started because of this. Whereas there were newspapers like the Hindu, which is famed to have actually sort of succumbed to all those things, but then substantially benefited in terms of sort of permissions to import the technology and expand its business in a big way. The Times of India, again, sort of was somewhere in between. The Hindustan Times resisted on day one of the emergency, but BG Verghese was shown the door the next day by the management, and this is how it happened. But what I think, when we come to this, the post 90s, what we call the shift to the market, it actually sort of enlarged the scope for, let's say, media to operate and earn a lot of its profit through advertisements, particularly with the coming into place in a big way of, let's say, consumer durables. And this is exactly what led Samir Jain to talk about he was making a commodity as much as somebody was making a talcum powder or soap, whatever it is. So in some sense, the government's hold over the media was loosening, particularly in the 90s. If there was one field where actually I think the state hold over an institution was loosening substantially, it was with the media. And I always hold this whole thing wherever, I mean, it wasn't about the state control, because whenever we talk about the media, let's look at, let's say, commercial cinema. Which is most controlled, that nothing can be put out before the censors, and that is where most of the violence and vulgarity is perpetuated and propagated. So it's, in a sense, it wasn't about a government control, but at the same time it was about the possibility of making tons and tons of money by way of just advertisement revenue, and not having to raise any of this revenue from its circulation. So that what we call the Radhi economics in the media is something that set. And alongside this, the new crop who actually came into the media, and I mean, let me keep telling that I mean, there are exceptions, but the new crop that came in were essentially people who were taught, even if they studied economics in college, they were not taught political economy or economic history, and they just simply thought, I mean, they were, I mean, most often confusing economics with accountancy. I mean, today what we have is every television channel calls the chartered accountant to expertise on sort of, economic subjects and issues and packages and so on and so forth. So in some sense, what I would actually call the people like us, the people like us syndrome began to affect, and so much so a large section of the journal, because I was myself actually reporting for a newspaper from Delhi, particularly post 1991, and one of my sort of I mean, the beats, as we used to have in print journalism, was, let's say, labor, and this was something very important. So I mean, what I found was a large number of reporters who came to sort of report on trade union actions happened to be those who were also doing the crime beat. So somewhere down the line, in this very important segment of the economy was completely pushed to the margins, and that is, again, it was a tendency that began with the pink press, but then it picked up and it sort of permeated. The coming of television altered, or rather sort of I mean, distorted this whole media scape substantially, and it turned out that sort of I mean, there was, I mean, I think there was this Hindi cinema that came around the same time called Dil Chahta Hai. I mean, I tell my students very often that I mean, there is a Dil Chahta Hai generation, because that was perhaps a film, and I would say that it was also an honest film which did not pretend to have a poor person or a slum dweller or a bonded labor anywhere in the frame. The entire cinema was just about all of these people, which is something that I mean, you also experience when you get into a mall. The architecture of a mall, the shopping mall, is something that it doesn't have windows. Naomi was actually talking about windows, but the shopping mall doesn't really sort of have windows, so much so that you can get inside there and sort of live in a world where there are no poor people, there are no slums, there is no poverty, and spend as much time that you want without realizing that the temperature outside is hot or cold or whatever it is. So in some sense, it was this kind of escaping into another world that actually sort of happened with, let's say, the media scene. And perhaps the biggest tragedy is, I mean, there is definitely the control, the newspaper management, or the owners of the media. In fact, what we now realize is, I think almost all the English television channels that compete with each other in terms of saying that we are ahead of you are all owned by the same set of people. So, but that notwithstanding, what I think is that the post-90s, what we call liberalized India, also produced a set of professionals in all these spaces who think that India is progressing. So it's some kind of a delusion when an ArcelorMittal actually when Mittal actually buys a broken down steel plant, or the Tatas actually buy a broken down automobile company in England, it's considered that India has arrived, kind of a thing. And it's this kind of a delusion that we are again a power, and it's time that we go about it, is perhaps, this perhaps is a big threat that I see. You don't need the press to be censored today.
Yeah, but that again goes into the idea that I want to talk about. One is grooming of a series of journalists that started during the emergency. You've spoken about it, you've written about it. Can you explain how that happened? This idea that these group of these people, that the BJP, RSS and the Sangh and many started grooming as early as the 1970s, and what roles that they have played over the last 30, 40 years?
Well, I think, the grooming, I think, happened both ways. In some sense, I think the 60s was a time, like, what Bob Dylan actually told us, or, the slogan that, Chairman Mao at that point of time actually gave, boycott classes and bombard the headquarters. I think, in some sense it happened. But what I feel is that, the collapse of the Soviet Union and, that idea of another world, and the absence of, let's say, in fact, the dogged refusal of the communist movement in India to even sort of, concede and, look at the possibilities of, let's say, the environmental cause, of, let's say, the Adivasi cause, and so on and so forth, and still sort of, remain stuck in some kind of, so the dream that they were actually sort of, they could have, they could sell, or they could actually sort of, promote in the 60s and the 70s, was no longer possible after the 1980s. And there wasn't this kind of, a realization that a humane society, in fact, that was something that begins to come, let's say, with the World Social Forum. And the kind of movements that began to happen, let's say, in Quebec 2000, and subsequently leading up to some kind of the resurgence again in Latin America and things like that. But in all these things, what went wrong was the idea of democracy linked to a kind of larger political economic concern. The wedding of these two things, or the merging of these two things, did not really happen. And that is where I think, it's not that we don't have people in the media who are, who are not talking about it. I think, I can list out several names that, of people who are talking about the migrant labor, the travesty of sort of, the nonsensical kind of a thing called labor or reforms that some of the governments are doing. These are not reforms. These are actually sort of, withdrawing the regulations and sort of exposing workers to the wolves. So there are journalists who are talking about it. But what I think has gone wrong, for instance, like, most of our journalists today in the mainstream television as well as the newspapers, unfortunately, do not understand what is dearness allowance. Because, they're all now part of a certain kind of a contract system where they understand a nonsense called the a package, and the nonsense called, cost to company. So in some sense, like, I have always noticed, and, well, it's quite a coincidence that there are two the installments of the DA that are announced. One happens in the month of March and the other happens in the month of September. And, I'm now sort of, sick and tired of sort of, seeing this September whenever it happens. The journalists and most of the media actually calls it Diwali bonanza for the salary or the government employees. Now, they don't understand some of these basic concepts. And that is where I think, I think the grooming took place elsewhere. That is the kind of destruction of public education in India, particularly institutions of public education. And I mean, I would definitely blame a generation of those who called themselves teachers in these institutions, who did not revise the syllabus, who did not update the syllabus, and went on talking about whatever they were taught in some kind of an era. And in that sense, I think and the most important of these was the retreat of economic history from, let's say, the faculties, I mean, from the departments of economics in universities across, barring, let's say, a few institutions like JNU or the Central University in Hyderabad and some other place. I mean, these issues are not talked about. So Ricardo once again becomes Adam Smith, once again becomes Gospels, and that perhaps is what. So I mean, kind of wealth again is talked in terms of sort of I mean, foreign exchange. You have sort of definitions of development in terms of software parks, not in terms of production centers, and so on and so forth. And agriculture having taken a complete kind of beating, the collapse of rural India. I mean, we have a Saina talking about it, we have a few other colleagues. I mean, I should mention Anumeha actually keeps talking about it. But I mean, what I think is necessary is to sort of, I mean, the grooming has to take shape in the larger context of a political vision. I mean, John Maynard Keynes has to be taught. So, yeah, I think, I mean, everybody does the grooming. Yes, there's a kind of grooming, but, that's more of some kind of sort of, I mean, fixing people in positions. Fixing people in positions, particularly in the media. I mean, there are umpteen number of examples. But what is more dangerous, and I would say, is sort of, I mean, reducing, let's say, journalism into a mere skill to sort of, I mean, handle gizmos and sort of, speak a certain kind of, aggressive language, or sort of, reducing anchoring a television discussion into some kind of a shouting match. And the very words are very disturbing. Everybody calls it my show. I mean, look, you're not in the business of showing. I mean, it's not a show business. Media is a calling. Journalism is a calling. So I think, I mean, somewhere down the line, this interrogation needs to take place. So I personally am not sort of, I mean, as much as sort of, there were dark experiences. Nobody expected, let's say, towards the end of 1976 that Indira Gandhi was going to call an election, for whatever reason. Likewise, I mean, I'm not really sort of pessimistic, but my only point is the current crisis is not just about sort of a knee-jerk reaction that the emergency was. What we are actually sort of in today is a systemic crisis. In fact, when somebody recently asked the finance minister whether it's a cyclical or systemic, and she just sort of made fun of that. But the point is, what we are actually sort of in now is a systemic crisis, a crisis of global capitalism in its neoliberal form. And in some sense, I should actually sort of, try to learn lessons of a similar kind of a systemic crisis that capitalism went through from the manifestation on the Wall Street crash in 1929 and what it led the world to. So it's not just about sort of India. I mean, there is definitely some kind of a conflict between several ideas of what humanity should be, several ideas of development, and so on and so forth. So I mean, I personally am hopeful, but in the sense, I mean, the collateral damage that the emergency actually caused, it really sort of cost a lot of lives. I mean, I can still sort of recall the face of a very young, bright student of the regional engineering college then at Trichy, at Calicut, Rajan, a name that actually remains in my mind all the time. And more important than Rajan, I mean, I remember his father, who actually fought that battle for years and years without hopes. And even when he actually began to believe or was informed sufficiently that his son was no longer alive, by people who even saw his son being sort of, tortured to death. Ichira warrior fought a battle, almost a one-man battle with very few people sort of, coming to help him. In some sense, the collateral damage will not be restricted to sort of, a few hundred people being in jail or a few hundred people having to sort of, give up their studies. I mean, I think, all those, a large number of people who resisted the emergency ended up actually sort of, giving up their studies. In fact, some of them actually turned out to be the most promising activists that I was talking about in the 1980s, the social movements, the democratic movements, and so on and so forth. Some of them also sort of, ended up becoming part of the establishment. I mean, we have some people who spent 19 months in jail, once again, in the government today. I mean, our own Minister for Information Broadcasting was one such person. But, having said that, I mean, I think, humanity will come over, get out of this crisis. I mean, it's not just about sort of, a crisis that one nation faces, I think. I mean, let's look at it. In the context of the words that sort of, come into our kind of a play. Development has sort of, assumed a certain kind of a meaning. So we need to sort of, relook a lot of things, learn from it. In that sense, I think the emergency is a very important landmark for us to keep learning, keep looking back, learning, relearning, unlearning.